So Bernays then starts talking about the interaction of public opinion with the forces that help make it. So the forces that help make public opinion, this phantasm that public relations guru Bernays has fabricated out of his ass. So this sounds pretty insidious. The public opinion, the forces that help make it. So Bernays strikes me as a fool who thinks he can control complex systems. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of complex systems. It's not just something that's complicated. A complex system is something that is vastly complicated, like each. Anyways, so I don't mean like a complex system like a car, right? I mean a complex system with chaos theory involved, like the weather. It's evident that the public opinion can be steered or at least influenced in some insidious way, right? Proceeding in a gradual, subtle way, but with harmful effects. It's insidious. So Bernays claims the press modify, at different times he claims different things, but he claims the press modify public opinion, right? But let's be clear, his earlier examples utilized more than just the press. When we think back to the hairnet company example and the more bacon example, right? He used Big Bacon's predetermined medical truths that their hired doctor articulated, right? Then that deception was propagated via all possible forms of communication media. So it's interesting that Bernays frames this chapter or this portion of the book, I can't remember if it was a chapter, just must have been a chapter, I don't know, but the interaction of public opinion with forces that help make it. So public opinion, as if it has a consciousness of its own, right? A meme theory. Perhaps this is just a manifestation of Bernays dehumanizing his targets. It's a detached way of thinking, of framing that he is only targeting, or working with, homeless opinions, and not what they actually are, or what they're really doing, which is messing with people's minds without their permission or awareness. Now, I'm trying to cut back on my swearing, so when I say messing with somebody's minds, I mean something more, right? So keep that in mind. So if I say messing from now on, that means, something more than just messing. Put an F in front of it. So also interesting word choice with the forces, which, that help make it, right? So which evokes imagery of a force like magnetism or perhaps, a military force, right? Something powerful in any event, and the benevolent tag that help make it, right? Help. Ooh, that word help. It must be good. It's benevolent help. Oh, it's helping, right? Helpful, right? What a load of shit. This guy's talking about manipulating people's minds. A non-bullshit translation of what Bernays is saying would be something along the lines of attack strategies on unsuspecting targets for the gain of malevolent sociopaths. There's a truthful translation, and then there's what the PR people say, right? So Bernays notes actions and interactions are ongoing between forces projected out to the public and the public itself. So these forces are not projected out. It's like a helping hand, right? The imagery that they're using, right? It's they're a secret spear thrust out in attack of the phantom world of the mind. There is no blood, so the targets usually don't know that they've been assaulted or warped to the will of some public relations client by public relations and all their ancillary, I can't think of the word, mechanisms. Bernays claims PR must understand what these forces of manipulation are, and he must be able to evaluate the relative powers with fair accuracy. This makes sense. So for our purposes, we too must understand them if we have any hope of defending our psyche from malevolent attack. So first, we must be aware that it's happening. Second, what techniques are they using? Third, how do we defend ourselves and others? And fourth, how do we counterattack? Now, sadly, a lot of people haven't even reached step one. They're not even aware that it's happening, right? So, of course, our studying critical thinking and logical fallacies are a prerequisite. But just being aware of it blunts the weapon and puts a major chink in their armor. Thinking PR and their ilk do not have any impact on us is the cognitive distortion of minimalization. Conversely, thinking that PR and their kind are all-powerful is the cognitive flaw of magnification. They aren't all-powerful, but they do and can have great impact. Different people, different effects. The fact that they have any effect on us or our actions, our opinions, our mode of thought is sufficient to cause alarm and justification for vigilance. Our society and almost everyone I know understate or underestimate the impact of the perception management complex. I did too, until my eyes were open. I had this teacher in high school who tried to warn us a little bit about it, and I thought, it can't be as bad as he's saying. I've seen the news. They're just innocuous. They just talk about the weather and tires and wintertime and boring news stuff, right? So, and then you start looking closer, and it's things that are important. You start realizing, holy shit, right? Buddy was right. So, I'm not talking about overt advertising or publicity for businesses, a book or an event. I'm talking about the convincing of things people would not believe if they had sufficient facts and the techniques to determine what is closest to the truth as possible. So we all instinctively try to determine that, but when we are unaware of the vulnerabilities of the undefended mind, malevolent forces capitalize on these hacks. So knowing something is an optical illusion doesn't stop our minds from seeing that illusion. Right, so judgment is of critical importance for such things as what is, fit to print, for news media, while keeping an eye on the number of readers they are keeping or losing. So the true business of news media is therefore eye minutes, how long your eyes are, reading their stuff, right? So this is that is attention from, as many eyeballs as possible for the longest period of time. So the point is judgment of the paper is critical to its well-being, and PR know this, yet it is the judgment of the targets they attack with no concern for the target's well-being. So for example, convincing as many people as possible that more bacon, regardless of what you were eating before, more bacon is a medical truth as being beneficial. It's no regard to the adverse health effects or the shortened lives, and probably deaths, given the large enough pool, from cardiovascular disease from eating so much more bacon, right? So Bernays, so long as the meat packers make more money, that's all they care, right? So Bernays repeats that while the press are forming public opinion, not modifying or altering, as he said earlier, but forming, they are also conforming to it. Now, so the press conform to the narrative that they are creating, right? The poor souls, right? It's clear bullshit. So it's odd that the press, who you think about, they introduced the world to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State atrocities. Yet that same press wrapped the public's knuckles for being Islamophobic, right? It's quite a 180. Now, if it many of you are old enough, but maybe some of you aren't, the 2 or 3 people that listen to this. And after 9/11, there was massive anti-Al-Qaeda, anti-Islamic State news articles on all mainstream media, which kind of makes you think that they might be controlled by some intelligence agencies, perhaps, or the military, Pentagon or something. But even in Canada, right? So less so in Canada. And then, a few years later, after, George W.'s gone and everything else, then now the news media are 180 degrees. If you do not like their ideology, you're Islamophobic. Right? So if one had to speculate, it would seem that it was the CIA or the military-industrial complex. So more than just the Pentagon, the big private. I'm thinking of probably Boeing or Lockheed or any corporations along those lines that are involved in the military-industrial complex that pushed the anti-Islamic narrative post 9/11. So the question then is, who is pushing the Islamophobic narrative now? Is it Saudi Arabia's royal family? Is it Iran? It comes, out of the mouth of the globalist WEF types, World Economic Forum types, like Justin Trudeau. So why would they protect that religious ideology while not the others, while actually fomenting hate against the others and allowing churches in Canada? There was this time when they were pushing this narrative. They would make assertions and assumptions about certain things, and then the massive amount of churches were being burned all across Canada. And that's not anti whatever religion those churches happen to be. It's it's understandable. Really, that's understandable? Burning fucking religious buildings, right? So it's not an even-handed defense of individuals' right to believe whatever nonsense they wish, or we would be hearing about the phobias that led to the churches being burned, right? But no, this is something else. Burning a mosque is a hate crime, but burning a church is not. How come? How come burning a mosque would be a hate crime, but burning a church is not a hate crime? A key line from Bernays is the office of the PR council to determine the interaction between the public and the press and other mediums affecting public opinion. So it's the office of the PR to determine the interaction between the public and the press and other mediums affecting public opinion. So the press are only responsible for their interaction of the public. Maybe not even, because he even says it's PR's responsibility to determine the interaction between the public and the press. It's not the press's, responsibility. It's public relations responsibility to determine the interaction of the public between the public and the press. Think about that, right? As well as the press and other mediums of public opinion. So PR determine this interaction, right? So it's not just exposure, but the experience. Bernays claims it's important to conform to the standards of media as it is to present ideas that conform to what the public will digest. So here we go. So this is a bit of the limits. So the only limits is what the public would be willing to believe, right? To what the public will digest within belief limits and moral limits of the target. So they may not believe it if it's a little too much, right? So the BS has to be presented in a fresh fashion and presented in a way so that the targets will swallow the bait, right? Catch their eye and make them bite. So this is the feedback or control the public has over the press. The BS has to be presented within the belief limits of the targets. So not what they believe, but within the extent of what they will believe. However, something the public will believe, but which the forces of opinion formation do not want them to, will be smeared as palpable absurdity, and the authority of that source of information will be attacked with great vengeance and furious anger. those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon you. Bang, bang, bang. Pulp Fiction. If you have no idea what I'm talking about. Classic Samuel L. Jackson. So a recent example of this is when Twitter, Facebook, and the lying journalists claimed the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation based on zero evidence, right? So they in fact knew it was true, and they claimed it wasn't. So they were actively spreading disinformation and trying to hide it from the public. So they ignored the evidence around the laptop. Well, I shouldn't say they ignored it. They suppressed the information, but they based their false narrative on nothing but false stories, and they blocked and censored those who dared repeat the truth. So this is not them just getting it wrong. This is something they knew, right? Following their normal standard SOPs, right? They knew it was true, and they just were going out of the way to spread disinformation, to lie, and to block the people who are actually telling the truth. This is what our journalists and Google and Amazon-based servers, right? Wasn't the whole deal, right? And Twitter and Facebook and all the mainstream media, and of course the left-leaning, the left aisle of the politics, right? We're all in league. They're all sharing the same lie, right? And it wasn't like they were, we just got it wrong. Fuck that. I mean, what was the word I was supposed to use instead of? I can't remember. So we reflect on that for a moment. If social media banned and silenced people who were speaking the truth, about that, what other truths has the social media and this new complex of big tech, mainstream media, the left aisle of politics, I'm sure the public health, right? Well, they weren't involved in this specific one, but I mean, they all seem to be a league with there's a major false narrative. So I guess it depends on the PR, like who funded that, right? It has to have been something like massive military or somebody with really, really deep pockets. This isn't just a Democrat party trying to silence that, because unless they have total control over the news media and Google and Twitter and Facebook, right? Right. It is when you stop and look and take a beat. It is really spooky. So this is the evidence that Henry Louis, I don't know if it's Louis. Is it Louis or Louis? Henry Louis Mencken. Maybe I'll call him Louis. Louis sounds funner. Henry Louis Mencken tried to warn us about 100 years ago. Is Louis French? Louis. I guess it could be. So it appears that Bernays is trying to point out the challenge of the press is not only to entertain the public, but manipulate the public while at the same time entertaining them, like some seductive succubus that enchants us while, unbeknownst to us, slowly pierces our mind with their fangled tentacle and sucks the life force out of us until we are mindless drones to her will. So Bernays quotes his enemy and our friend Henry Louis Mencken again about how the press pleases the crowd. So this is what he says. The way they set about giving the good show was by first selecting a deserving victim and then putting him magnificently to the torture. So this was their method when they were performing for their own profit only, when there was one motive to make the public read the paper. But it was still their motive when they were battling bravely and unselfishly for the public good in discharging the highest duty of their profession. So I interpret, Mencken, of course, to be sarcastic at the end, right? From what little I know of the guy, given the other motive is to manipulate the public. So Bernays mentions the complementary working forces in movies, for example, with the producers, actors, and the press in their support are waging battle against censorship. You ever wonder why sometimes you see news pushing a movie, right? Is this news? Is it news that you're pushing a new movie, right? So the key point in context in a book about PR, he mentions how the press work with the movie industry. So take from that what you will. Now, of course, not the movie industry. I'm sure there's not a monolith. There's a lot of varying varying actors in the movie industry, varying actors in the industry at play. Like, different producers have different, points of view, and some are maybe more, I don't know, I can't think of the word right now. So Bernays claims censorship will last as long as the public allows it to. So is he so concerned, with censorship? Is there some PR schemes he wants to do but can't because of censorship? Or is he implying censorship as a weapon to be used by PR? In modern times, many people, including myself, screamed about how wrong it was to censor the true story of Hunter Biden and his laptop. But the censorship not only persisted, it grew more encompassing. And by blocking the people who spoke the truth, this is the level of which they went. I agree some things should not be publicly broadcast, but those certain things within, should not be hidden by those seeking that information out. Like, for example, this Hunter Biden laptop. This should have been broadcast. But there are other stories that maybe shouldn't be broadcast, but that information shouldn't be hidden. But this is within reason and judgment. Of course, there are certain things that the public maybe should be not aware of, maybe not aware of, but I guess if there's, national secrets, right? You think of something that, could harm the nation, if the enemy's got hands on, like trade secrets, or how to make, some super plasma destructo weapon. Some of that stuff maybe shouldn't be publicly available information. Right? That kind of makes sense. Because there might be bad actors within the public, but there also may be bad actors outside of the public. And if it's public information, then people outside the country, like the jet engine. I'm not sure how many of you know the history of the jet engine, but there was this British guy, Whittle, who was fighting the incompetent morons in the British government and British military by designing and coming up with the jet engine in like 1920s and 30s. And they were fighting him the entire time and, calling him an idiot. And, I'm sure I don't know specifically if they called him an idiot, but pretty much their actions determined that, that's what they were thinking, right? They were blocking him and stopping him, and they screwed him over. And he patented the jet engine. And so when the Nazis came around in the 30s, they saw his patent. And so they took his jet engine and built, the first, jet engine. The Nazis, the jet engines, and the stupid British morons, would have in government and military like this. Why does the government and military have to be so stupid? Right. Anyway, so they fought him. It's not that they didn't support him. They actively almost, shut him down, made it difficult for him to do anything. Right. So I can't remember what my point was. That information. Yeah. So that information was public. Right. He patented it. And that's what happened. So now the Nazis got his information because that information was public. And if the British government weren't such complete fucking idiots, which I'm sure they still are today, possibly even worse, they would have helped him develop that technology in such a manner like the Americans did. Once the Americans got their hands on this technology, they were like full force. They had Boeing and, the modern military industrial complex. These guys, Rolls-Royce actually, once they got their hands on it too, they were like, yeah, we're both feet on this technology. And poor Whittle ended up getting screwed, and the whole situation was made that he couldn't even go in competition against the other guys over his own invention. So, I mean, the guy totally got the shaft, anyways. So not only, getting back to Hunter Biden, right? So not only is that, should that Hunter Biden story have not been censored, it should have been broadcast, and it should have been, made available to the public, right? And it would have been by a class of valid journalists, but which it wasn't, which tells us everything we need to know about the efficacy and validity of journalism today in mainstream media. I remember actually talking to people at a coffee shop, and there was one guy who knew the story, and he and I talked about it, and the other guys were all mainstream sheep, and they were like getting angry at us for talking about the story, and we're like, well, what are you getting upset over? It's a valid story. It's true, and it's amazing how people can be manipulated. Now, I don't know what they heard in mainstream media that made them upset, or triggered them to be upset when we would talk about the Hunter. Maybe because they were so, anti-Trump, that they assumed that since we were talking about Hunter Biden's laptop, that we were advocating for Trump in some way by exposing the story about Hunter Biden's corruption, his kids' corruption, and the whole Ukrainian thing way back then. So an example of how PR manipulated the public to endorse something they would otherwise condemn is the play Damaged Goods. So according to Bernays, it's a really old play. It goes back to the 20s. Damaged Goods. Apparently, it was some sort of sexual liberation crap, right? So PR figured back in the day it would be condemned by the public and believed in education and truth, which are, of course, two separate things, right? There's same with science, right? There's different meanings to the word science. There's the literal interpretation, and then there's the natural interpretation that public relations can manipulate, and it's a false meaning, right? Just like education. Education should be, instructing and showing new ways and adding to your schemata. But a lot of times education can be conscripted to manipulate people away from the truth or towards something else, right? So instead of educating the public with the play as is, they needed the PR needed a large dose of manipulation. So the PR allowed group leaders and groups interested in education to come to support the drama, to sponsor the production. They were allowed to come to sponsor it. Oh, we're allowing you to come and sponsor it. You see how they really? Anyways, so I'm going to allow you to support this drama in order for me to cash in on your prestige of position. Cool? See you there. This is right. Where's the quid pro quo? So what did the manipulators give to those group leaders? What the public relations give to those group leaders that came to the play? Right, they allowed them to come, right, in exchange for their using their reputation, right. Bernays doesn't say what they did, right, but he's trying to make an argument that the public and those who manipulate them interact. No doubt they interact, right. So why is he arguing this point? I think he's using a weird, convoluted explanation to show instances where manipulation had effect. So he cites books there where at one point were condemned and they were later demanded. That change of opinion is implicitly due to the manipulation of PR given his context, which it may not be. There's zeitgeist. Now, I'm sure manipulation and advertising and all kinds of factors go into the zeitgeist of an era or an epoch, an epic. I'm not sure. Is it epic or epoch? Jesus. Anyways, so you have the zeitgeist, the sort of the collective. It's a vague, general, not specific. Like people, when you hear a stale joke, right? Generally, people might not find that joke humorous anymore, right? Because they've been exposed to it. That's sort of the zeitgeist, right? Sort of a type of humor is no longer funny because the population generally have heard it and they don't find it funny. Now, this is different from a social hive mind where everybody thinks the same thing. Right? I'm not talking about that. So Bernays cites a magazine for writing a pro-beer article. Right, this is back in Prohibition. So it believed that is what the public wanted. So is his point that fanning the flames is an effective technique of PR? I don't know. Bernays talks about how PR must be within the moral limits of the targets. So belief limits and moral limits, it seems likely, keeping in mind that these are limits of changing or creating an opinion in the public, in the targets. So if you want to change or create a new opinion in the targets, you have to be giving your narrative within their belief limits or their moral limits. If you're giving it something that they believe but is beyond what they morally agree to, then they are, of course, not going to subscribe to your propaganda, right? So we've all heard the famous publisher and populist Joe Pulitzer, right? He was a populist. So all you people that are anti-populism, Joe Pulitzer was a populist. So he established the Pulitzer Prize and named it after himself. So he battled with Charles Anderson Dana, the publisher of The Sun, who attacked Pulitzer as the Jew who denied his race and religion. So this was an attempt to cost Pulitzer his Jewish subscriptions, which apparently fractured Pulitzer's health. Now, Pulitzer was a Catholic whose mother was born to a Jewish family. So this sort of, they tried to get to the deepest core of him. Maybe he felt guilt maybe about not being Jewish because his mother was Jewish, or, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I have no idea what his crap was, right? But the deal was, he wasn't even Jewish, right? His mother was Jewish, so I'm sure he didn't have any hate towards Jews, right? But the guy, Charles Anderson Dana, went for the most personal attack he possibly could, right? So 6 years later, he was in a bitter circulation battle. Pulitzer was. Joe was in a bitter circulation battle with William Randolph Hearst. Some of you have heard of him. He had a journal. It was called The Journal, in which there was no apparent restrictions on sensationalism or fabrication of news. Sounds like things haven't really changed too much today, but back then when Cuba rebelled, so this is going back to the late 1800s, right? So Cuba rebelled against Spanish rule in 1898. And these guys thought this is a catalyst that they could use to make sensationalist or news, right? To try to get eyeballs, right? Clickbait. So Pulitzer and Hertz tried to outdo each other in whipping up faux outrage against the Spanish, both calling for war against Spain. This is egregious, right? So after a U.S. battleship mysteriously blew up in Havana's harbor, the U.S. Congress reacted to the outcry from these newspapers with a war resolution. After the war, Pulitzer withdrew from what he had. Did he claim it? I'm not sure, but it was called yellow journalism. So it had become known as yellow journalism. So he tried to withdraw from it. So I suppose Pulitzer realized the power of bullshit and lies over the nation. Maybe he assumed that people were smart enough to know that they were making up things like this can't be true, right? But the public was, generally duped, right? So he tried to make amends and tried to expose the corruption. Maybe he knew the public was being duped. I'm not sure, but he obviously felt guilty. So apparently this Pulitzer guy apparently has a conscience. So he exposed the fraudulent payment of millions by the U.S. To a French Panama Canal company. So the government lashed back with a lawsuit for his libeling of President Theodore Roosevelt and the banker J.P. Morgan. Right? These sound like heroes, right? But Pulitzer did not back down, and the indictments were dismissed. Pulitzer famously said, and I quote, "A republic and its press will rise or fall together. An able, disinterested, public-spirited press with trained intelligence to know the right and courage to do it can preserve that public virtue without which popular government is a sham and a mockery. A cynical, mercenary, demagogic press will produce in time a people as base as itself. The power to mold the future of the republic will be in the hands of the journalists of future generations. The power to mold the future of the republic will be in the hands of the journalists of future generations. Notice his choice of the word cynical, a cynical, mercenary, demagogic press. That's pretty much what we have today. They are definitely not disinterested. They are biased, right? They are not public-spirited. They are elite-spirited. Right? Do they have the trained intelligence? They have a manipulated intelligence to support woke bigotry. So a mercenary implies payment. So a demagogue is a great word, right? It means a leader who obtains power by means of impassioned appeals to emotions and prejudice of the populace, which implies the people who coined this term were aware of the fallacies of appeals to emotions and prejudices, which apparently not too many are anymore. So demagogue also means a leader of the common people in ancient times. Historically, a leader of the people, right? A person who sways the people by oration and persuasion, right? The implication of those who coined this term, of this definition, is that persuasion of the people appeals to the emotions are not good, right? So that means the persuasion is most likely to a falsity, unless they are saying demagogues might be using their emotional appeals and powers of persuasion for good. I don't think that's why this term was coined, right? So Pulitzer's tale is an example of the flaw of humans, our vulnerabilities, human vulnerabilities. His experience proved to him the error of yellow journalism, presumably because he had morals. But his warnings fall on the deaf ears of the next generations who dismiss his experience. That rebellious trait is good for breaking dogma, but clearly is bad when there are valid warnings from the experienced ghosts of our collective past. Joe Pulitzer organized a fundraiser to help pay for the pedestal in New York that the Statue of Liberty stands on, so it could be shipped and put on it. Right. So he died in 1911, and control of his newspaper went to his idiot son Ralph. It's funny how sometimes the next generations can be inverted shadows. So Bernays cites Ralph, the idiot Ralph Pulitzer, who claims that the crap the press does to the public is the fault of the public, specifically that the people and press are more interested in the polemical than the platitudinous. Polemical means strongly critical, controversial, or disputatious writing or speech. And platitudes are boring statements expressed as if they are original. So this podcast may be considered polemical, strongly critical, as well it might be considered a long series of platitudes and boring. Right? So I don't know what Ralph Pulitzer, the idiot, would have to say about this, but it doesn't really matter because Ralph sounds like a dick. So if the press were actually polemical or severely critical, that would be a good thing if they were calling out bullshit. But it's a very bad thing if it uses fallacious reasoning to attack the truth. His dad, Joe Pulitzer, the hero, surely knew that. So truth has no fear of challenge unless the attacker has an uncritical mind and appears to fallacies. Why does that keep? Of course, people would prefer to hear polemical stories over boring platitudes. That's obvious. But the statement is also, it's an either-or fallacy, so Ralph is an idiot. There are other types of stories than just harsh criticisms or boring platitudes. You think a guy named Pulitzer would know that. But Ralph continues, the public and press are more interested in blame than painting the lily. Right? When I first heard this, I was like, what the fuck? So painting the lily doesn't mean something, someone's painting a picture of a lily or of a woman named Lily. It means to add embellishment to something that is already beautiful. It's from Shakespeare's King John. To gild refined gold, to paint the lily, is a wasteful and ridiculous excess. So I've never heard that expression before, to paint the lily. It makes sense, right? I like the expression, but not the guy that was saying it. So the woke bigots today hate beauty. So we don't hear that expression anymore. To recognize beauty is to objectify it, right? Objectify is a weird word to be implied as a pejorative, as it means to cause something to have objective reality, to give expression to an abstract notion, a feeling or an idea in a form that can be experienced and shared with others, to bring one's abstract ideas into the objective world and share them with others. That sounds like a beautiful thing. But I forgot, beautiful things are bad according to these woke bigots. So that's why objectification is a bad thing, right? We don't want things to be shared and brought into objective reality. They don't even believe there is an objective reality, right? So, they're screaming that, that treats, women as objects, right? But aren't we all objects, right? If we aren't objects, what are we? Now, the definition of an object is something perceptible by one or more of the senses. So it's a phenomenon, which is something perceptible by our senses. So these woke bigots might scream, things. It treats women as things. That's what they mean by objectification, turning them into a thing. There are three definitions of a thing. An object that cannot be named. If there's no name for it, we just call it a thing. So an individual or an inanimate object. It also means a creature. So I don't recognize the beauty of a woman implies that they are inanimate, right? I don't think anybody thinks that if you recognize the beauty of a woman, that makes them inanimate. And they can be named, right? So we're left with the creature. So the definition of, in this situation, they have to be meaning creatures, right? So the definition of a creature is a living being, a human, an imaginary or fantastical being. So where in these definitions is the recognition of beauty a derogatory thing? I can think of two scenarios. Beautiful women who do not want to be recognized by men, they don't find beautiful, or women who don't consider themselves beautiful, jealous of the recognition of other women as beautiful. In both cases, they are using beauty as their guide, so they have to recognize the concept of beauty. I could picture some purple-haired uggo at Disney, smashing her keyboard about the evils of catcalling because she's never been whistled at. If a construction worker, whistling or not, is your life's issue, you need to reorganize your priorities, right? But I get it. We are on this planet to reproduce, and uggos are upset to the core of their being by being passed over. So instead of getting motivated to make themselves more suitable for procreation, they take the easy road out and blame the men who do not find their hideousness attractive. Conversely, the hotties are insulted that such unsuitable males are daring to think that they have a chance, and they get upset over that, right? So if George Clooney or Brad Pitt said, "Hey, I like your hair," would they get upset? It's even not that construction workers are unattractive. It's most likely their low social standing that upsets the hotties, right? Do they think, I look like the type who would settle for a working class schlop? Oh, and it's the men that are the problem, right? So, most guys I know have never yelled, "Hey, baby," to some stranger, and most women I know don't care if there's a whistle from a construction site. That's the impact of this whole thing. Anyway, so Ralph Pulitzer, Ralph the idiot Pulitzer said the public and press are more interested in blame than painting the lily, in attack than sending laudatory coals to Newcastle. So there's some more WTF here. So apparently going back to the 1600s, it was well known that Newcastle was located on massive coal fields. So now you're beginning to get that, right? So apparently, so sending coal to Newcastle obviously meant doing something that was pointless. And laudatory is praise. So Ralph is saying people prefer to read about attack than pointless or unnecessary praise. I would argue today we see all this praise of royals and garbage in the United States. So that is pointless praise, or of celebrity assholes, right? So that is pointless praise. And there's magazines based on this. So it appears what Ralph, and by extension Bernays, is trying to say is the public is more emotionally triggered by attacks and tribalism than a cogent argument breaking down the pros and cons of something in an unbiased way. It's just interesting that Bernays is not quoting the senior Pulitzer, Joey, probably because Joey tried to warn us of the manipulative douchebags who might use the press as a weapon of manipulation, specifically the Edward Bernays of the world. Bernays quotes some dude called Mr. Leupp, L-E-U-P-P, I don't know, who leans closer to blaming the common man. And he says, "Whatever we may say of the modern press on its less commendable side," at least he's admitting the press are scumbags, "we are bound to admit that newspapers, like governments, fairly reflect the people they serve." I've never heard of this Leupp guy. Leupp? I don't know. Regardless, if I had, his assertion sans evidence is not cogent. It's true that papers like the Toronto Star are biased, bigoted, and idiotic, and most likely do represent their subscribers. So there is some plausibility to Mr. Leupp's assertion, but a government who is voted in by a minority of the population cannot be successfully argued to reflect the entire population that they serve. Perhaps that is the key word. Douchebag politicians like Justin Trudeau don't serve the entire population. They only serve the small vested interests that fund them. Or, who knows what's going on right in the back rooms. So a common trope in comedy is to do things in thirds. So Bernays' citation blaming the common man for the acts of the press is from Charles Dudley Warner. And he writes, "No matter how objectionable the character of a paper may be, it is always a trifle better than the patrons on whom it relies for its support." Holy shit. So there's a distinction that Bernays is not making. It's that different papers have different audiences, and that the unbiased position of objectivity is non-existent in mainstream media. He's implying it, but he's not saying it. Because the objective person is like venom to a manipulator like Edward Bernays. The perception management complex do not want objective people or concepts to exist. It just makes life more difficult for the manipulator if the target has ideological defenses, like unbiased objectivity, or at least the striving for it, or the awareness of it. These guys sound like Gustav Le Bon, advising Hitler. How does one get feedback during a speech, in such a way as it alters one's content in real time, no less? These guys sound like Gustav Le Bon advising Hitler. How does one get feedback during speech in such a way as to alter one's content in real time? So Bernays quotes some guy named Gladstone on this, and Gladstone writes, "The speaker," well, I'm assuming he means what the speaker gets from his hearers in a mist, he gives back in a shower. So newspapers receive from the public as well and gives to it. Too often what it gets as dust, it gives back as mud, but that does not alter the relation. So I think this Gladstone dude is ripping a hole in Bernays' point. It looks like he's saying that the speaker magnifies a point or points they think the audience is communicating. That dust may be given back as mud, Mud to me is not meant to be a good thing. It can be good for life in a swamp, but not so much when it comes to clear communications. Clear as mud. So there is no force that compels communicators to imagine what the audience is thinking and amplify that message back to them. This is a moronic and useless form of communication. Why bother at all? If you're just communicating to people what you think they think you are and not add anything, it's useless. It is boring platitudes. It's carrying coal to Newcastle. Their logic is false. I don't know how they're getting feedback in real time. I guess jeers, maybe, if you're in front of a crowd, and how do they verify exactly interpret what the crowd means, right? Because there is no one, right? But beyond that false logic, it gets worse by amplifying potential noise. So if they interpret something to mean something, they, try to amplify that back to the crowd. Like this is not how a rational person communicates. So what if someone wants a single lump of sugar in their coffee? The logic of the press is to dump a kilogram of white death over their cup, and then blame the person for the antics of the press. Like it's a non sequitur. It does not follow. This is coming from the great minds of PR. Either he knows better, or he's being deceptive, or he's an uncritical thinker. And since this is a book written for their tribe to pass the legacy of their knowledge on, I would err on the side of them being uncritical thinkers, which, with a motive to dehumanize the targets to soothe their guilt. I'm assuming if they have any guilt, but they're sociopaths. So all sociopaths, again, my definition of sociopaths is they're doing something that they know is wrong. If they didn't know it was wrong, they'd be psychopaths. So at least Gladstone, whoever that is, gives some blame to the press. I guess giving all the blame to the public would be beyond most people's moral and belief limits. So he has to pull back a bit on the rhetoric, right, in order for it to enter their mind. But again, this is not a book written for the public. It's written for the elites. So Gladstone wrote, "It follows that the responsibility for the more crying evils of journalism must be divided." I call bullshit. A journalist, the one who performs the evil, is fully responsible for her actions, regardless of what she thinks the target public wants to hear. This is what Joey Pulitzer warned us about: the low, manipulative scumbags that use journalism as a tool of manipulation. A form of this is of his yellow journalism. It's disheartening to realize journalists and politicians don't bother taking the objective truth into consideration, only perceptions. Their perceptions of what they think the public perceives, which is based on the faulty logic of stereotype. Truth, objective reality do not factor in. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the political establishment. In fact, objective is reframed as somehow being pejorative. Objective, in all its definitions, is a virtue, despite what the woke bigots try to say. We are all objects. Human beings are objects, as are clouds, horses, and the sun. Just an object, just a human. Putting just a in front of something is a manipulative tool. It's similar to the so-called. Just a tries to amplify the object as somehow low quality or to minimize its implied severity. Right? So-called tries to reduce the validity of a thing. The so-called X. It was just an X. The so-called protest. It was just a protest. The so-called vaccine. It was just a shot. Truth, objective reality do not factor in. It's like wanting to like a celebrity until you hear them talk and realize they are giant assholes. I won't name any because I don't want to give them any free publicity with my 3 followers. But there is no shortage of asshole celebrities making their idiotic, close-minded views known. Yet again, Bernays is being deceptive when he claims the public and the press, lecture and screen are led by each other. In reality, the public is being manipulated or led to believe what some wealthy client wants, and the only recognized feedback the public gives to the manipulator are moral and belief limits, which are only for the practical reasons of effect. The public does not knowingly participate in the game. They aren't knowingly giving back feedback. They are targets. Even a rabbit knows it's being hunted, generally, not all the times. So he goes on to the power of interacting forces that go to make up the public opinion. How is this different from what he was just talking about? Bernays has added the word power to his force and oddly added nothing to the public side of the equation. So I don't want to just crap on Bernays. I'm trying to filter through his BS to find any techniques that have effect so that we can create a viable defense. Bernays claims influence depends on the success with which it is able to enlist established points of view. So PR looks at what they interpret are common opinions and tries to incorporate as many of those as possible to their campaign of manipulation. This is the technique Mao used. Quote a bunch of reason and credible crap and stuff that the people are already, prepped on, right? Prepared on. And then mix your evil juice in with that. The unsuspecting suckers might drink it all in, right? Bit by bit, you remove reason and add more juice. Eventually, you have enough juice to control the targets to a sufficient degree needed for your purpose. This gives the cult members snippets of reason to quote to the outsiders. Look, Master is reasonable. He said X. Right? The problem is when the cult members become too drunk on the juice and they've lost all reason and they can no longer differentiate what is a reasonable person thinks is reasonable. So they end up quoting crap like 2 + 2 = 4 is the result of white heteronormative patriarchy, or somehow proof of the veracity of their insane ideological cult. Or they claim to fight discrimination by creating the most discriminatory ideology there has ever been. So Bernays drops the ball by claiming there's a middle ground between malleable and stubborn. Another way to say mentally malleable is the target is easily able to be exploited. But malleable is fine too. Malleable means to be controlled or altered by outside forces or influences. Malleable does not mean open-minded or open to suggestion based on logic and reason. Malleable means controlled by outside forces, exploitable. Stubborn, of course, means a determination not to change one's position in spite of good arguments or reasons to do so. Stubborn is not the opposite of malleable. Stubborn is subjective and not an objective label. There may be good arguments that don't sway because they are better arguments to another direction. If a mule does not want to walk, the owner may call it stubborn. But maybe the mule is beat tired or just does not give a shit what the owner wants. Or a salesman may think a customer that doesn't buy is stubborn. Perhaps the crap they're selling is overpriced or poor quality, or the customer just does not give a shit and doesn't want the crap. Right? Of course, one is if one is closed-minded, they may also be stubborn. They may be. But stubborn is not closed-minded. In the mindset of the manipulator, compliance and malleability are synonymous. Compliance is not based on logic and sound arguments. It is subservience to the will of others, which could be due to force, perception of harm, deception, payment. The causes are many. In this context, stubbornness is a virtue. Stubbornness against manipulation is something to which we all should aspire. But we don't want to be closed-minded and resilient to the truth. We need to give weight to the various different forms of reasoning. We have deduction, a priori, pure logic. We give lots of weight to that. Then we have induction, statistics, a posteriori, observations with sufficient numbers and valid causation. Less weight because statistics are notoriously easy to misinterpret and give false conclusions. Then we have abductive, which is best guess. We should not give that much weight. And then we have assertions, which we should give no weight. And then we have manipulation, which we give negative weight, right? This should be obvious to all adults, but sadly it is not. Unfounded assertions are given the most weight, and the dangers of statistics are infamous. Add to this, we need to be hyper-vigilant and recognize logical fallacies, and that being a fallacy obviously means they have no weight to influence our opinion. We have a special form of stubbornness that allows in good data, but blocks bad. It needs to be like a firewall, a highly resilient, highly critical, yet allows functionality. PR and the rest of the perception management complex are the viruses and Trojans designed to distort our accurate perception of reality. Perhaps we should look into our immune system to see what types of algorithms nature has created over the past few million years that might be transferable to the idea of defense of data integrity. That might make an interesting episode. For now, using a gross oversimplification of our immune system for our ideological immune response could be a complex system, but escalation of resources, right? So this is our immune system escalates our resources until the threat is neutralized. So it shows no mercy to the invader. It acts decisively and quickly. It takes note of anything foreign or alien, no matter how apparently insignificant. Is this me or is this not me? It's not me, it's foreign, it's alien. Kill it. Right? So ring the alarm when a valid threat is detected. Analyze the threat before killing it. Keep a record of that threat, perhaps the techniques that threat tried to use, and don't wait for damage to occur. Kill it as soon as it's detected. Employ the cytotoxic mode and kill our own that have been compromised. So this can be mapped as a methodology to an ideological immune response, but we must realize that models have limits, and the immune model doesn't cover how we determine a friendly from foe. So I'm not claiming the immune system is a valid model. I'm just throwing it against the wall to see if anything sticks. It's kind of funny to think of it that way, but another analogy for the manipulation of PR would be the news as a drug, which is used to spike the target's mental drinks. They're Kool-Aid, right? So the targets take it unwittingly, and then the PR drags them into an alley and rapes their minds in public. And then they get the Stockholm Syndrome and defend their abusers. I guess a simpler model would be that of an alien intelligence giving unsuspecting targets cognitive lotus flowers to drug them, which turns them into mindless drones that push the alien's agenda. There's a lot of fun models we can come up with, right? So I'm meaning alien as in in foreign or external, but the UFO type works, just as well. So interpret at will. Interpret how you wish. Fire at will. The changing of one's mind without permission or awareness is way worse than any microaggressions woke bigots come up with. It's actually a serious situation. Is there even a word for someone who is resilient to manipulation? It's not just being resilient to manipulation, it's also allowing valid data in. Sound judgment would be the closest, I think. Is it better to look at the concept holistically integrated? Holistically is an interesting word. Holistically with a W is British, and it's or Old English. It means sound, like solid or uninjured. And then there's holistic, which is just HOL, is Greek, and it means all. So it's funny how people conflate those two words, holistic. It's different words, different meanings. Anyways, so is it better to look at the concept holistically integrated in a holistically integrated way as a spectrum or as a cognitive firewall than just, differentiated little bits, right? I can't think of a word specifically for cognitive firewall at a proper setting. A skeptic might be more resilient to blatant, overt manipulation, but that doesn't appear to be the case. There are many skeptics in many conflicting religions. They can't all be right. So presumably the majority, if not all of them, are skeptical yet somehow allowed manipulative false information in at some point in their life. So on top of their being more likely to err on the side of cynicism and be an apophenic type 2 and not see valid connections in new valid information. So if your firewall is too lax, you're gullible type 1, you see phantom connections as valid and everything gets in. We're shooting for a 1.5 on the apophenia scale, right? We need the word for type 1.5 Goldilocks setting of our cognitive firewall. We sound judgment, but you have to suspend judgment at times, right? So suspending judgment is part of sound judgment, But even then, sound judgment is not an impenetrable force, right? There are always crafty ways trolls can breach the keep, right? The viruses are always finding new ways. They're attacking, and they have ways to break through our immune system. It's the same with ideological attacks. Sometimes, the crap ones are obvious and they fall to the ground, and then there's other ones that stick, right? So sometimes the best defense is a good offense. We, the schmaltzy little people, need to start fighting back. Not just defense of the dark arts, but offense against them. So is your suspension of judgment still judgment? Yes. Judgment doesn't mean you have to come up with a conclusion or a finalized opinion. Judgment includes tentative, pending, and undetermined assessments. I don't know is a valid judgment, despite what our teachers tried to hammer into us. Though it would be perhaps more clear if we said suspension of conclusion, just to make it clear, but I don't know if that sounds any better. So can you have type 1 and type 2 apophenia simultaneously, both seeing phantom connections and not seeing valid ones? Well, of course you can. We all do, most likely all the time, but not on the same topic. What would be a form of cognitive dissonance? No, I don't think so. Because when we're making false connections or we are blind to valid ones, we are totally unaware of it, right? Usually, when we become aware of it, that's the good part, right? That's when we start, let's take a look at this, right? It's just a story that normally we interpret wrong. Though at times it can lead to cognitive dissonance when there's contradictory logic or evidence on the same subject. So the perception of contradictory information. So suspension of judgment and thinking, who knows, at that point, would pause the whole thinking routine on that topic and be a mistake. It's precisely at that moment when our alarm bells should be ringing, and the last thing we should do is suspend judgment in terms of pausing our thinking. Of course, we shouldn't come to a final conclusion, but that doesn't mean we should stop judging and analyzing it, right? So this is when we gain new valid insights. When we detect the dissonance and pull on the threads, we could be experiencing apophenia of some type. We might be making phantom connections. It could be our logic is wrong, or it could be the evidence is wrong. It could be we are wrong, or it could be everything is correct, right? But we are blind to a bridge, blind to a valid connection that would tie things better. We are all blind to many things, probably most things. The fact we are not omniscient proves that. Considering if there's an infinite number of things and we know a finite amount of things, then what we know is infinitesimally small. Right? The fact that So there are many things that pass through our senses that we do not process. Our subjective reality is a fabrication in our minds from not pure data, but from our filtered interpretation of the data from our senses. That doesn't mean our interpretations are valid as objective reality. They are clearly not, as we are fooled by illusions and inattention, among any other things. That's not our truth, that's our error. So there are many filters that we apply to a specific topic. Our bullshit filter may be full of bullshit itself. It's most likely not 100% accurate, right? So we all make these type 1, type 2 errors. We are not omniscient. Of course, we are going to sometimes make mistakes in seeing phantom connections and sometimes blind to valid connections. I really need to drive this because it seems to not stick. So not having those errors is a voyage, not a destination. So it takes a special kind of stupid to think you never make mistakes. Introspective versus retrospective versus what do you call holding a mirror up to one's thoughts and actions? Is that retrospective? Introspective is the word, but I use that more for reasoning and thoughts, crap in your head. But reflectospective is a better word for your words, actions, interactions in the objective world, right? We need to see patterns, but those patterns need to be filtered through our most valid judgment. Natural selection has us err on the side of seeing false connections, right? There might be dangers in the bush, right? Think if there's a beast and there isn't, right? It doesn't, obviously, if there isn't, you survive. And if there is, you survive, right? Well, you have a better chance, right? For obvious reasons. But it's not hard to train ourselves to be type 2s and be blind to patterns that are there, blind to valid evidence, blind to valid connections. So those will be the first people to be eaten when the zombie apocalypse comes. Just because we're skeptical in no way means we are not naive. Just because we are skeptical in no way means we know or are experienced. Even then, naivete can be reduced with experience, but not erased. Experience and judgment are two separate things. You can have a lot of experience and still have crap judgment. Why else do Nigerian princes target the elderly? I mean, who has more experience than the elderly, right? You can have little experience and have sound judgment, but are probably still going to make novice mistakes due to false, simplistic assumptions and thinking the complex system is simpler and manageable. Of course, you can have little experience and poor judgment. There's a lot of different ways we can mix these concepts together. You can have a lot of experience and sound judgment, though that is a lot less common in ourselves than most of us think. Think of the people who live their entire lives believing something that was false. Did their vast, lifelong experience show them the truth? No. Experience by itself proves nothing. It depends if there's an accurate feedback mechanism for our judgment in that experience. If there's no feedback, then that experience is just noise, right? The experience can help us get closer to the truth, but we need feedback from objective reality to know if we're on the right path. So there are many false paths and poor choices. Somewhere there's a better option, but the choices are infinite. So we need to base our choices on certain criteria. So these are what? Emotional? Are we emotional about this, or are we calm, cool, and collected? If we're emotional, recognize that as a red flag. Criticality, being critical. Those choices are based first on, are we being critical? Are we questioning, or are we passive? Are we being led to make certain choices? How does our cognitive firewall work? Does it work? Does it check for known bad guys and block recognized and suspicious? How does our immune system work? It checks for deviation from the norm and escalates the response as necessary to eradicate the alien invader. Firewalls are pretty dumb, but they are adaptive via human upgrades. The adaptability of firewalls is just the capitalization of the human quality of adaptability. So it's not the firewall that's adapting, it's humans coming and collecting new information and updating. Now with AI, that might change. But so are these two processes infallible? Of course not. Computers get hacked and people do die of illness. So our immune system and firewalls are not infallible. So cognitive firewall. Check yourself, what you're receiving, and check your source for what they're transmitting. Does this warrant any of my attention? If so, why? Am I responding emotionally to this? It's a red flag. Am I questioning the veracity? Am I experienced on the subject? Do I have feedback with that experience? Am I jumping to false conclusions or phantom connections? Am I ignoring valid evidence? Am I not seeing valid connections? Am I blind to the invisible bridge? Am I being apophenic? Right? Are Are the person giving you the information just making assertions with no evidence, right? Am I making assertions with no evidence? Are they just telling an anecdote, which is it's hard to disprove an anecdote. Anecdotes happen, but there may not be meaning to that anecdote that the people are ascribing to it. So is that anecdote framed or skewed in a certain way? Are they magnifying and minimizing important parts which distort the truth? Am I magnifying or minimizing? Is that anecdote used to extrapolate a stereotype? Are they using logical fallacies? Are they using appeals to emotion? What are their sources? Are those sources biased? If there are studies, who paid for it? Is it difficult to find out who paid for it? Is there not enough evidence? Should I suspend judgment? Is there a bit of dissonance that I might tug at? Is there some clues that I say, this smells wrong? What's that smell, right? So does their evidence, if any, make sense? Is there a logical flaw or anomaly? Is your gut warning you? Should it be warning you? And it's not, right? At any rate, there is some psychometric term for one's resilience, or is there, for our resilience to manipulation? I emailed the CIA, but they didn't get back to me. So is there a genetic trait? I'm sure everyone can learn the skills, right? It appears like our immune system, we have a bit of innate defense to manipulation. We are hardwired genetically at different rates to be resilient to manipulation for two different degrees. But we need to nurture that, right? We need to develop our adaptive responses to manipulation, as the cognitive pathogens used by perception management today are more advanced than our glacial genetic evolution. We need to be more astute. But it's an arms race. The manipulation class will also adapt to our new defenses. Like all massive organizations, they will be slower to change than the individual. The problem being their organizations, while massive, are still smaller and possibly quicker to change than the mass of society. So, though great change can come quick, it may not be quick enough for us. Right? So Bernays sounds like a reporter when he wrote, some analytics or analysts believe that the public has no opinions except those which various institutions provide ready-made for it. So which analysts is he talking about? And why should we care what those analysts believe? Right? Some analysts believe that the public has no opinions. Well, who cares who these analysts are and who cares what they believe, right? They might be a valid assertion, but it's an assertion, right? So their belief is not valid evidence. Appealing to some anonymous analyst is also fallacious appeals. It's not valid evidence, right? It's just a basket of bullshit from Bernays. So he drops another deuce of deduction when he writes, from Mr. Mencken, our hero here, the good guy, Mr. Mencken, Louis, and others, it would almost seem to follow that papers and other mediums have no standards except those which the public provides, and that therefore they are substantially without influence upon the public mind. So a natural interpretation that Bernays is making is he's implying that Mencken craps on the newspaper's lack of standards, and Mencken thinks this lack of standards that reduces the public's interest in the papers. But it appears that Bernays is adding the tag, which the public provides, and also adds it in the context of influence on the public mind. So we don't know what Mencken actually said, or if he even said anything, as this whole construct is a straw man fallacy by Bernays. But from what little I know of Mencken, which isn't much, is that he would most likely claim my natural interpretation, and Bernays is most likely adding those tags along with a bogus argumentative form with the weasel word almost. Of it almost seems to follow. And his definite conclusion, therefore, to fool the lazy reader into thinking it's valid logic instead of just a spin. Spin which has a fallacious meta-message which miraculously supports Bernays' earlier claim that the public is to blame for any moral failings and reporters. And they are also to blame for not buying the deceptive rags of yellow journalism and propaganda. Implying, see, even my enemies think the public is to blame for what the reporters do. The whole disgusting paragraph smells of dog vomit. The form is bullshit premise starting with the weasel word, it almost seems X, where X is a truth appended to Bernays' first bullshit message. No second premise, just straight to the conclusion, therefore Y, where Y is Bernays' other bullshit message. Non sequitur, straw man with a dose of Mao. It's rarely straightforward, single dimension deception with this level of deceptive sociopath. It's a layer cake of deception, a strata of shit, a strata shit cake. So he's not even claiming the public have influence over the press, only that the press have the supposed same standards as the public, which is an assertion sans evidence. And even if it were true, that in no way indemnifies the press from their actions. There isn't even a claim of coercion from the public. It's clear in form that Bernays is not trying to inform his reader. He's attempting to manipulate the reader. Since his target audience is obviously the so-called elite, it's clear that Bernays thinks he is smarter and can dupe them. Just another target in the sociopathic PR's mind. So Bernays' cards are revealed. This guy says over and over how the public and manipulators influence each other, which we covered earlier, that the public only limits the extent at which the manipulators can attack via moral and belief limits. Bernays quotes the Ray Stannard Baker, who wrote how politicians and diplomats at conferences in Versailles were so worried about the guesses and opinions of reporters and the reactions that came back to them. He doesn't say from who or what the reactions were coming from, the public, the press, or the people in their inner circles, or if it was the actual public, which is highly unlikely, what percentage of them were reacting, or even in those reactions were unified. Were they pro, were they con, or what? Or they just reactions? Was it the intensity of the reaction? So this Baker guy went on, the problem of publicity consumed an astonishing amount of time, anxiety, and discussion among the leaders of the conference. It influenced the entire procedure, which ultimately pushed some heads of state into small, secret conferences. This Baker story is nothing more than anecdote, but it does give evidence to the weight diplomats and politicians gave to the press and ultimately to public opinion, or at least what they perceive as the public opinion. Perhaps it's not meant to manipulate the public at all. Perhaps news is meant to manipulate those whose hands are on the levers, the scummy politicians. So that's a more powerful take of the news, right? Bernays writes that other causes are the movie industry and professional baseball. Right? So we've all seen bullshit propaganda, political agendas being taken up by pro sports, especially, the BLM, BS. The BLM has an agenda among many other Marxist agendas, along with many other Marxist agendas, as they are a Marxist organization. And they had on their website to break up the nuclear family. The source, the source being their website. So what possible benefit is there to break up the family unit? Going back to the Soviet days in East Germany, the Stasi, of course, did a study to find that kids from broken homes were much easier to manipulate than kids from a nuclear family. That is a normal family with a mother and a father. So Bernays refers to how the Hague Conference was forced to open its doors to reporters. The scary thing about this is, how did the reporters give the delegates accurate information as to the state of the mind of the people back home? Newspapers are not a two-way dialogue. And this was 100 years ago, 150, 120 years ago, whatever. So just how would a reporter know what the public is thinking without input from that public? Because they tell them what to think. Reporters don't hear the disapproval of the public as they read the paper. It's a one-way discourse. In fact, today in 2023, was 2022, I think, a Toronto Star reporter wrote that she knows what the premier of the province is thinking and wants. So clearly, that idiocy has not gone away. This is a trend I'm seeing in books about manipulation. They argue that they miraculously get complete and accurate feedback from their one-way discourse in real time, be that speeches, articles, in printed, or in movies, right? It's amazing. It's truly amazing. Now, one of them explains the mechanism of this miraculous, instant, and accurate feedback, which also happens to be monolithic and stereotypical, right? Odd that. If they were actually getting accurate feedback from the public, which is diverse, they would be aware there is not a unified opinion from any mass of individuals. Even if we try to make connections not explicitly said, like book sales or letters to the editor or even question and answer sessions, there isn't sufficient time for the real-time feedback of the examples given. Especially in 1923, they are not sufficient methods to get an accurate reading of the public opinion, right? Especially since one does not exist. So if somebody writes a letter to the editor, that's only one person's opinion. That is not the entire public's opinion, right? So if they were using the inductive logic of statistics, they might be able to give us, percentages of how many think X, but this is not the case as their feedback was immediate and in real time. Real time meaning, of course, with no apparent delay. I recognized this anomaly before with Gustave Le Bon and others, but it's oddly prevalent. I would assume that it's a bit of BS that dupes often, and that is why they use it, or they used to use it, as they must know that their guesses of what the public thinks are not facts, right? They have to know this. Or do they believe it? I asked a Toronto Star reporter that, and she has yet to reply. So when it comes to the question of incompetence versus deception, in the context of a book about deception, I would have to lean towards deception. So they know they're lying to us. Anyways, Bernays mentioning the fear inflicted by the press on diplomats and the world leaders is apparently to sell the necessity of PR at all levels, and tries to sell more than fear by claiming the trial balloons of ideas that can be sent up to gauge the public's opinion on it. And in that mechanism of the press, giving leaders feedback from the people is deeply suspect. Bernays quotes an article that refers to the press and others who express public opinion in action as the men whose business it is to make the public opinion. So I don't know why the mealy-mouthed shitbag Bernays dances around it so much. Early in the book, he eventually claims that PR creates the news and the news creates the public opinion, despite all his mumbo-jumbo earlier, right? So it doesn't mean it's true, although apparently there is a fact. So the point is for us to recognize the methodology PR claims it subscribes to. So let's try to be as clear as possible. This is why Bernays conflates the press with the public opinion. In his mind, the sheep only think what they are told to. We can expect this to be a common belief in the PR sector of today. So in Bernays' mind, the press are public opinion, despite the press not successfully manipulating everyone to buy their newspapers. And today, news media are tanking. The ratings are going down. Less and less people are tuning in. So there may be conflicting press, and the most obvious, individuals have independent minds and beliefs, which apparently is not a thing that the press and the media recognize. Politicians, that the idiot schlops in the street can actually think for themselves. It's not possible. So the press guessing or asserting the public's opinion is therefore a fallacy on multiple levels. Yet there is apparently effect to their method on a statistical level, as our personal anecdotes will surely reveal. we all know people who believe obvious bullshit from the press, so there is some effect. This is why we cannot disregard their techniques, but they are not as powerful as they think or as they claim. They might argue there are dissenting opinions because there is dissenting press telling them to think those views. But, what about public opinion being responsible for the press's egregious actions as claimed earlier by Bernays? So either the public have a mind or they do not. If Bernays' claim is true, then the dissenting press is around due to dissenting people. Then who are the creators of that dissent? Right? Obviously, some people somewhere can think. Right? It's pretty self-evident. Right? Manipulators do not believe in the concept of reason, and the idiot public having the mental capacity to see evidence and be able to come up with their own conclusions without being told what to think. To think of the people as vacant, non-player characters is on the spectrum of psychopathy. Right? If they actually believe this, there might be psychopaths, not sociopaths. So a psychopath, of course, being someone who thinks of others as non-living creatures, which manifests as impaired empathy and lack of remorse. Like in the 2014 movie Guardians of the Galaxy, when Buddy says, won't there be hundreds of Sakaran soldiers inside? And the Dave Bautista character says, I think of Sakaran as paper people. Right? That's being a psychopath. That is actually being a racist psychopath, thinking of an entire people as non-living objects, specifically paper in this case. But of course, it doesn't have to be that literal. It's not surprising that Disney, being infected with woke bigotry, would promote racist psychopathy. And yet, Mark Twain is banned reading. Right? So, Bernays claims foreign policy is determined by public opinion, which is a blatant sales pitch which implies the power and the need for PR, which can determine foreign policy if one has deep enough pockets. However, the public clearly does not determine foreign policy, as much as it is even revealed to the public. The only thing the public determines in regard to foreign policy are the limits, how far the government can go, as much as the public is aware of. And if one manipulates the public's limits, they can, of course, push their policy that much further. But things are really hidden from the people by the government, right? So a lot of things. I worked at a secret government organization that was hidden from the public for decades. I wasn't even convinced it was real when I sent a resume to the building. I saw the picture of the building in the book. So, I read about the organization, so I mailed the resume off, which is one of the reasons I got the job, though I guess it's a woke hellhole today. So the book, in case you're interested, was called Spy World, How CSE Spies on Canadians in the World, and it was written by a guy named Mike Frost, who I think escaped the country and is now happily retired in the United States somewhere. So the organization has since come out of the shadows. My point is just how much effect do you think public opinion had in determining the actions of a secret government organization? Right? In the messy, overt world, the public does have a limiting factor, but no say otherwise. Just like the whole Iraq fiasco. Anyone with at least half a brain knew there was zero evidence linking Iraq and 9/11, but the perception management complex mostly implied a connection, but pushed hard on Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction, and poor old Colin Powell was milked of his credibility by the perception management group and used like toilet paper when they made him lie to the public. So that was back when the military-industrial complex and big oil were using Republicans. Today it's the globalists controlling the intelligence apparatus and the Democrats. It's hard to tell who the puppets and who the masters are anymore, from the outside anyways. Perhaps even on the inside. The most successful manipulation leaves the targets not knowing that they were manipulated. So grab the bull's nose ring and the rest of the beast will follow willingly. So the post-9/11 propaganda sold lies of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, that ended in a massively protracted war. The only beneficiaries were the military-industrial complex and big oil. Everyone else paid the price. That policy wasn't determined by the public. It was sold to the public by fanning the flames of fear. The righteous will rise with burning eyes and ill will. Madmen fed on fear and lies to beat, burn, and kill. It was obvious to me then as it is now. I don't believe anyone who claims we did not know better. Bull fucking shit. No one is that stupid. So that was a PR attack that didn't work as well as they hoped. The newspapers acted as if it did. As a tactic, they try to shut up the masses who saw through it, an attempt to make the majority feel that they are a minority, the outliers, the lone wolves that no one else will believe. There were, of course, idiot Canadians who believed the news narrative that all Americans bought the bullshit hook, line, and sinker, which does demonstrate how gullible those Canadians are to propaganda and manipulation. It's odd that those Canadians didn't buy the first wave of U.S. propaganda, but did buy the second. Perhaps their interpretation of the second wave was promoted by the Canadian news, which pushed and fed an anti-American sentiment. Regardless, it uses the fallacious logic of stereotype to think all Americans are the same. What's worse is those Canadians do that despite a gross amount of evidence which proves otherwise. As we know, being blind to valid evidence is delusional and type 2 epiphania, not seeing valid patterns or connections. So it's clear Bernays is simply trying to sell PR as he throws Harvard appointing a PR counselor after his talk about foreign policy. The only consistent thread of thought is the need for PR. So I would have hoped that Harvard would have studied the effect of manipulation of PR, but they apparently went with hiring the PR counselor to utilize it. So maybe they did study it. They're like, hey, let's get on with this, right? This is a powerful tool, manipulate people. So Bernays claims on almost every page the institutions which make public opinion conform to the demands of the public. Over and over and over, this guy says this. So repetition is a common tool of learning, conditioning, and of course, manipulation and brainwashing. Though I don't know if Bernays is doing it for his own self-programming or, conscience soothing or for our sake. I would lean towards the latter. Bernays tries to sell the benevolent use of PR by referring to the Safety First movement and the Rockefeller Foundation and their program on hookworm. Oh, wasn't the Rockefellers? Aren't they great people? Rockefeller today has a legacy of being an evil globalist ghoul, the Monty Burns incarnate. His virtue signaling, one time apparently benevolent use of PR, is perhaps not sufficient to quell his malevolent reputation. So, yet again, Bernays claims PR must enlist the established point of view. Established or believed by who? Right? It appears that Bernays is actually saying PR must act as if it is the established point of view. This is probably what he really means by enlist. So it's not a simple fallacious appeal to the masses like citizens think S or X and colleagues think X. It has to have a since or because before the claim to make the target assume it is fact. Since citizens think X, or because our colleagues think X, right? Of course, it's a nuance, but this is what I think he's trying to get at. Right? Of course, another layer of framing those as the better people could also be used, right? Since honest people think X, or because our top colleagues think X, right? You can keep adding layers of fallacious bullshit, which is apparently what they do. Despite all their work, it's simple to recognize their assertions. If they have no evidence, they can flower it up all they like, and it's still obvious. There is a more crafty way, and that is the assumption as seen in leading questions or false premises, right? So why did you want to kill the victim? So it's not just why did you kill them, it's why did you want to kill the victim, right? So obviously if you did not kill the victim, asking why you wanted to do something that you did not do is a false premise, right? You might hear a politician saying, I don't agree or accept that that premise of that question, right? Or they'll just answer the question they wished somebody asked them and ignore the the actual question and just puke out, talking points. Some dude called William T. Smith wrote, insisting that someone define their terms and formulate a coherent question predicated on truth is perfectly reasonable. But for those who prefer to obfuscate, redirect, or parrot ideologically driven drivel, definitions and truth are irrelevant. Oh my God, this guy's like scratching an itch. I would argue that truth and definitions are source material to be deformed to the manipulator's goals. As Bernays stresses, the manipulator must enlist the established beliefs or points of view. A definition or truth is simply something a target believes. There is a technique of manipulation where the word science is called on to sway people. Not actual science, but the word science, hoping the targets are too lazy to think about it more than a few seconds and are too ignorant to know what science actually means. This is the fallacious appeal to the word science, not the concept of science, but just the word. If one campaign harps X is bad, a new campaign harps X is good. The technique is to simply say science is about change, and it has changed, and now says, or in a new light of evidence, it says this, right? Which are valid concepts in isolation, but when tagged with manipulation, they are vectors of attack. Science, actual science, is not about change. Science is about the capacity to change in the light of new, valid evidence, stronger evidence, not just any old bullshit evidence or any old new evidence. New is not the operative word. New, valid evidence, stronger evidence, right? Science is clearly not about unfounded assertions about X that change depending on what big money is dictating that week, right? The trick works a lot on a lot of fools, even those in science, which makes me think that there are so many academics that are phony, so many people that have been pushed through or paid for their degrees, right? And they're just phony garbage, phony, incompetent fools. So this, and it works a lot on the pro-science community. And of course, I'm pro-science. I'm amongst the pro-science community. But it's amongst the pro-science community who are not smart enough to know just how to apply the basic principles of the scientific method to their reasoning. So these are the false prophets of science, right? The idiots that think they're smart, but they are not, right? And none of us are that smart. So they're led to epiphanies that have been officially sanctioned by some smelly sack of moldy money, right? It's not science. It's a tactic. It's a fallacious appeal to the name of science. So getting back to this Mencken guy, he must be a real thorn in Bernays' ass. I should research the guy more and do a podcast on him and his writing. But Bernays, he refers to this quote as editorial bravery. And when you hear Bernays calling something editorial bravery, your bullshit alarm should be triggered. So here's the editorial bravery as defined or as called by so-called by Bernays. A newspaper must carry the news, both pleasant and unpleasant. Nevertheless, in times of stress and bleak despair, a newspaper has a hard and fast duty to perform in keeping up the morale of the community. Like scumbag reporters of papers have a reputation of keeping the morale of the community up. Right? Granted, Bernays didn't claim they do that. He just said they have a duty to do it. Duty. I said duty. Why is Bernays blowing smoke up journalists' ass, right? Why would he take this blatant bullshit stance? Reality, as we all observe, is quite the opposite, right? If it bleeds, it leads, right? Controversy where there isn't any. Fallacious appeals to an injustice when there wasn't any, right? Emotional appeals to create a response, whether of bleak despair or stress or hatred, division, whatever gets attention, tribalism, right? Their resource. So it can be converted into their product, right? So the attention being their resource and their product being your emotion. So not reason, not information, not truth, but emotion. So how is that quote in any way brave? Papers and PR scum claiming to the public that the public want X, or polls indicate X, or experts say X, are all fallacious appeals to the mob or fallacious appeals to a title. So as I went over, or a fallacious appeal to the establishment, whatever you want to call it, you can call it anything, right? So as I went over in another podcast, courts have often recognized experts who completely contradict each other under oath in a court of law where lying gets you charged. So logically, there being an expert, even a court-recognized expert, is not sufficient to prove that they are accurate. Right? Bernays admits that some newspapers are leaders in public movements. Movement implies an objective of what they believe should be done. Now, this is not just conveying news, right? This is the type of people that Joe Pulitzer warned us about. Activist journalists are literally the type of people that should not be journalists, according to Joe Pulitzer. Now, of course, I could be appealing to Joe Pulitzer, but given his massive education and how wrong it is to do yellow journalism, that's why I'm quoting him, right? So Bernays recognizes there's a flaw in his simplistic thinking, that the public get their opinion from the churches, news media, movies, as there exists public opinion that is independent of these vectors of attack. So slow clap for Bernays, right? It only took him half the book to finally recognize this. Bernays also recognizes that manipulators need to recognize the limits of his traditional vectors. He writes, how for these institutions affect the public opinion? He must discover what the stimuli are to which public opinion responds most readily. So enter fallacious appeals to the word science and not the concept of science. As the targets are pro-science, they want to be viewed as pro-science, but are too stupid or cognitively lazy to actually use the methods of critical thought and questioning, of sources, etc. Waste all that time and money learning about cognitive biases, yet still believe CNN. Humans are definitely fallible. This could have something to do with the idea that you have to take other scientists' word for things sometimes, for if you're crunched for time, but you shouldn't never have to take their word for it. That is not science. This person's an expert. They wrote this paper, therefore I will believe it. That is not science. Even if your job tells you that's what you're supposed to do, that is not science. You need to independently validate that first, right? Otherwise it could be false. And if you're going on that conclusion, you're too lazy or you don't have the resources to do it, you have to recognize that it is not proven. Just because somebody has a peer-reviewed paper on something doesn't mean it's fact, especially if you haven't reviewed it yourself, right? So, or, experiment. If you haven't tried to replicate it at home, doesn't mean it, or at home, in your in-house. Is manipulation that powerful, or people that stupid? In regards to what stimuli the public responds most readily, according to Bernays, he claims a fundamental study of group and individual psychology is required before PR can determine how readily the targets will accept modifications of their viewpoints. Bernays wrote modifications of viewpoints, not modifications of their viewpoints. I added the their. So it's an apparent distancing, a detaching of ownership of opinion, a dehumanization and disregard of the right to think freely, will accept modifications of viewpoints. I put the there in because it just sounds wrong, right? Will accept modifications of viewpoints. So it's just an inorganic thing that can be changed, right? Like the paint on a wall. Opinions instead of what it is, the destruction of the fabric of one's soul and organic character as determined by our natural opinions and judgments. So He writes, for a lucid conception of the functions, power, and social utility of the PR Council, it is virtually important to have a clear grasp on the fundamentals with which he must work. Yes, the social utility of women not cutting their hair, or everyone to eat more bacon, or the public to inject substances into their bodies without knowing the adverse long-term effects. Social utility, my ass. PR is just control over others. Pure and simple, that is it. Not just what they think, but also, and perhaps more importantly, how they think. Since the Marxists believe there is nothing but power, no truth but power, no wonder there are so many leftist weirdos who embrace the tactics of PR in news, movies, and the rest, agitprop. So Bernays goes on to an understanding of the fundamentals of the public motivation, blah, 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 blah. So Bernays' science of PR calls for the use of stereotypes. He literally says stereotypes. Recall, stereotype is a known fallacious cognitive error of overgeneralizing a thing based on insufficient sample size. It appears like induction or using statistics, but with a case of one or a few, i.e. using anecdotes to claim false generalizations about the thing, right? It's faulty reasoning that we've all fallen victim to at some point. But Bernays isn't trying to find the truth or reason, right? He's not trying to reason something out. He's trying to manipulate as many people as possible to believe whatever narrative his client is paying him to. He uses capitalist and Boy Scout as examples. He mentions how stereotypes bring about definite images to the hearer. Strong mental images are brainwashing 101. Bernays' tactic to use stereotypes for that end, right? They are, he says, they are more comprehensible than detailed descriptions. They're more understandable than detailed, so they are more impactful. Meme-like. So implies the public is not capable or willing to comprehend detailed things, which is plausible, but just an implied assertion or a hidden premise. So the technique of using stereotype is effective at persuading others, according to Bernays. So those who aspire to be astute should resist the urge to use it as a tool of the dark side, of fallacy, and being creatures of habit and mimicry, we start thinking in stereotype instead of just using it as a tool. The best thing to do is to create the habit of seeking it out and calling it out as fallacious. Then we are more likely to see it in our own flawed thinking. The highway to hell is paved in good intentions. So even if we think we might be using the tools of the dark side for good, like the monkey's paw, we might not be getting what we expect, or just end up adding more pavers on the highway. So why waste time and energy doing that? Right? Is there time when we want to deceive our enemies? It's probably best to defeat them with logic and reason, but I'm beginning to think that may be a naive position. Still, it appears using the tools of the dark side will turn us into sociopathic pieces of shit like Bernays, politicians, and the rest of the perception management complex. Not interested in truth, just whatever power money can buy. Ultimately, one would think that the most powerful person acquires the most accurate information and modes of reasoning, but that appears to be a simplistic assumption. Typically, one would only want to manipulate someone else to believe something untrue. Otherwise, just show them the truth. There's no need for deception. So I don't want to conflate secrecy with deception. We need to keep secrets from malevolent forces. It's a jungle out there. I suppose at some levels, deception and manipulation are justified against hostile forces. Bernays quotes the Lippmann turd who argues for stereotype. These guys, they advocate for stereotypes, and it appears that they take to heart, and think think in stereotype. It's got them this far in life, so apparently they just don't care if it's not broke, right? They are exploited victims, perhaps, of something. I don't know. Are they? Is there some meme theory like consciousness exploiting their gullibility and lust for power and control over others via any means possible? Is that likely? So we are left to assume they are failed humans, pieces of shit. Perhaps they are recognizing a cognitive flaw in a critical mass of people and are simply capitalizing on that, sans morality. Without getting into a diatribe about whether morality is a social construct or not, it appears to be a natural trait as we see it in the wild, right, in wild animals. So the innate morality is perhaps hijacked by external conditioning. Although I've seen a lot of animals do a lot of really psycho things. I mean, blue jays are the worst. They just kill other birds and animals and fly away. They don't eat them. They just rip them apart, kill them, and take off. Now, all these people, birds don't do that. Yeah, they do. I got a lot of blue jays in my backyard. So, though some argue religion and explicit morals are from our innate capacities, but like any crowd, people of any specific religion are not monolithic in opinions, beliefs, or morals, be they written down or not, right? Bernays claims Lippmann finds stereotype at the center of the code by which sections of the public live. And stereotype, according to Lippmann, largely determines what we see, what facts we see, and in what light we see them. The implication is that we are blind to facts if we do not think in stereotype, according to this douchebag Lippmann. So while our mental library of concepts or schemata, as well as the attention, obviously limit what we see or perceive, we are not based on stereotype, though we could be infested with it. But I agree that stereotype does influence one's perceptions on that topic, especially if they're not being critical of it. Bernays quotes Marx's Communist Manifesto and claims if you have the editor's pattern in your mind, the editor of the manifesto, why not just the author's frame of mind? Right? Why is that about the editor of the manifesto, not the author? You will see vividly the facts that confirm that pattern, vaguely and ineffectively those that contradict it. If you have a communist pattern, you will see what you and the editor happen to see in common. So he's talking about shared apophenia. If I'm interpreting this right, he's implying the manifesto is impartial with both arguments for and against its insane ideology. There are no facts in it against itself, to ineffectively see. Otherwise, using Bernays' logic, I would have seen all those facts in the manifesto as I disagree with it, and I should have seen the facts that confirm my disagreement if they were put forward in that manifesto. But Bernays may have a point about the readers who share the author's pattern, the editor's pattern of mind. They will likely make the same false connections as the authors did and be blind to valid connections the author did not make. So it's a form of shared apophenia. Like, are like minds just those who share the same patterns of thought, right? The same patterns of false beliefs, right? We can be tricked to see patterns that are not there, like the Kuleshov effect. The Kuleshov effect is an editing effect where the nondescript image can have various meanings interpreted by the viewer, depending on what is cut or juxtaposed right next to it. Alfred Hitchcock explained it with an example of a sequence. A man's face, a woman holding a baby, the man smiles. Right? The interpretation is that he is a kind gentleman. Same footage, same exact footage, but change the middle part to a woman in a bikini, and now he's a dirty pervert. Same footage of the man, nothing has changed in the footage, just the juxtaposition or the comparison of the different footage of women, different women in between his smile and his face changes the interpretation. So the same can be done with any image. You can claim somebody looks like they're farting or stoned, and we could project that interpretation onto any headshot. But the Kuleshov effect can be used to project emotional content onto anyone. I think pretty much any emotion onto anyone, right? Hunger, sorrow, lust, jealousy, fear, pride. For Bernays to even mention the word facts in the same paragraph as Karl Marx is clearly an attempt at deception. Granted, I just used the word facts in the same sentence as Marx. So Lippmann uses his stereotype of a capitalist and a socialist to explain they all think in stereotypes of each other. So he's using a stereotype of each of them to say that they all think in stereotypes of each other. So Lippmann is aware that he is thinking in stereotype, and he still does it. Clearly, he has not made the connection that it is a logically fallacious way to think. To clarify, to think all Marxists are imbeciles based on the words and actions of a couple, punks is truly a stereotype and should be avoided. But to think Marxists are all imbeciles based on the imbecilic ideology that they subscribe to, which by definition puts them in the class, is not just rational, it's mandatory. There is a difference between the definition or archetype and a stereotype. The definition of a Marxist is an imbecile who subscribes to an ideology of insanity. So it is not a stereotype, it is the definition. Bernays is referring to bias in the mindset of an uncritical mind. Bernays claims everyone with the same pattern thinks the same way. What is his definition of pattern? I assume he means mental pattern. So then what does he mean by mental pattern? I have to further assume he means the same mental pattern of apophenia, which he never mentions. So I'm being overly generous by filling in his blanks to try to make sense of what he's saying. So I'm trying to find a way for his vague wording to make sense. This is a common trick of the manipulator. Keep it vague. Let everyone interpret it in their own way, which is fine for art, but this book on manipulation is not art. It is a manifesto of evil. One might argue that being critical is a pattern of thought, but we don't know what he means by pattern. So patterns of questioning, patterns of observation, patterns of inference, patterns of attention or patterns of interest, right? Is critical thinking a pattern of reasoning? Perhaps. But if one is not consciously being critical and looking for fallacies, they are not a critical thinker. Bernays' claim of sharing the editor's pattern is a bogus claim. Agreeing with someone does not mean that we share their pattern. A reasonable person might be able to convince an irrational person. With irrational people, it's pretty much chaos taking over whether they believe something or not. There is no rational pattern to their thought, hence the irrational tag. They, by definition, are irrational. So this convincing and therefore agreement does not mean that the irrational person and the rational person share the same pattern of thought. Just because two people wind up at the same destination does not mean they took the same path or will continue on the same path. One might even be there by mistake.